Hi, today on Voices of in the Wilderness, we have Dr. Joel Duff, who is a plant biologist and professor of biology at the University of Akron since 1999. He received his BS in biology from Kelvin College and his PhD in botany from the University of Tennessee. He has worked on numerous plant and animal systems using molecular methods to understand biological diversity. An author of more than 50 articles in science journals, he is also published in Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith and maintains a blog, Naturalis Historia, where he writes about the intersection of faith and science. All right, well, let's start with an icebreaker. What was something you thought would be easy until you tried it?
Teaching genetics.
Something I thought would be easy. Yes. That is the first thing that came to my mind, because I originally said, yeah, sure, I can do that, especially since my job might depend on it. But it turned out to be very hard. But I think we just got a dog recently, and I thought, that's going to be easy. It's been great, but not necessarily easy.
Is it a puppy?
Like
because you're not getting sleep if it's a puppy, right?
Yeah. It's been a little while now, so he's mellowed out. But the puppy days were kind of a harken back. I have 5 kids, so we went through all those stages originally, and I thought was done, but it's kind of like a reminder.
A friend of mine and I, we got a black lab at the same time, both puppies. They were sisters, and he posted something just after we got him. He said, I thought I was getting a Labrador, and I got a Velociraptor. So it could be tough. But thank you for joining us today, Joel. We've followed you for a long time online, and I'm going to let Kristine open with questions, and I'm going to come in and counterpunch.
Sounds great.
Well, let's start by talking about the article that you wrote with David McMillan. The title is a play on words, Dissent with Modification. It's catchy. You started it with David, and it was from a blog post of his, I think. What happened next? How did that all work?
Well, I was originally, I've written a lot of posts on my blog, and that's a form of communication to the general public. But I had this feeling like I needed to press forward and try to publish something that was related to things I was interested in on the blog, but put that out in sort of a peer-reviewed, in the peer-reviewed world, right, in the literature. That's a whole nother level. It's easy to just write what you want on a blog, and I think rightly be criticized that you can be kind of loose with your words and maybe not do as much careful work with your references and so forth. And to be able to have your peers review you is very important. And also, I wanted to have a peer-reviewed source that other people could reference when they're talking about this topic of hyperspeciation and creationism. Give them a reference that was from peer-reviewed literature versus just referencing a blog. So I was seeking a topic that I thought would be publishable, and David's article really kind of gave me the kernel that was of an idea that we could sort of grow and expand from there.
All right, so tell us what's in the article. What's it about?
At its root, it looks at how should I put this? It's an examination of what I would consider 30 years of growth in young Earth creationism toward a view that is expressing this idea that species have evolved since Noah's flood, and that's something that has become more prominent in their discussions and on their apologetic side. And so we wanted to explore this idea and contrast and compare that with conventional evolutionary biology. But also where we published it is in a journal that goes to people that are interested in teaching and understanding how to educate in the area of evolutionary biology. And so we thought it was important that educators sort of know what's sort of the modern biology of creationism, because many of their students will have heard these types of things. They'll have gone to the Creation Museum or the Ark Encounter. Maybe they're coming to their classroom and it's like, oh, well, this is what I heard that evolution is. And I think educators should have some idea of what that entails. So we wanted to kind of give educators an overview of what modern young Earth creationism is now saying about how species were formed.
Okay. So one of the things I hear a lot of Christians in particular say is that microevolution can happen, but not macroevolution. So how do young Earth creationist organizations propagate this idea? And it sounds like that's changing too.
That's as my other co-author Thomas Beatman would say. He would say that's a form of, I guess, lexical semantics going on. All right, the semantics going on that they've changed the terms for their own use. And microevolution and macroevolution have certain meanings for an evolutionary biologist. But when creationists use those terms, they often have a different meaning in mind that meets a demand of their audience. And I think it's kind of the way to make their followers kind of comfortable. Sort of like, okay, I've heard of this evolution thing. I know there's this natural selection stuff, and some of that sounds really reasonable. So what can I believe and what shouldn't I believe? Well, there's this, we'll just lump everything into microevolution as all the things that are okay to believe, right? That are kind of obvious in the world around us and we can't deny. And then macroevolution, though, is kind of reserved for all those things that we say can't have happened, or they're not allowed. Our interpretation of scripture says that this can't have happened. So we kind of call that macroevolution, goo to the zoo, or as Ken Ham likes to say, he likes to talk about microbes to man, and sort of lumps that into this idea of really broad, deep scale changes in organisms. And so by putting those two things into two sort of bags, you can say, anytime we come up with something that is kind of like okay for you to believe, we'll just call that microevolution. But those aren't really the definitions of micro and macroevolution. So and again, going back to this manuscript, I'm trying to tell teachers and educators that when your student hears the word microevolution, they're thinking something completely different than what you think or have been trained microevolution actually is.
So what's a better way of understanding the terms microevolution and macroevolution? Like, let's get this good definitions. What's rather than the bait and switch?
Good definition. I'll start with a simple definition. Some of the simplest way it's defined in a typical classical evolutionary textbook would just be that microevolution is small scale changes or changes in allele frequencies, a genetic definition in populations. So how populations are changing over time. And then macroevolution would be all changes that occur at the species level and higher. So, and some people would put that boundary there as like when what causes us two populations to become two different species, then you're sort of into the realm of macroevolution. Now, I don't want to pretend this is easy. Evolutionary biologists have lots of squabbles among themselves about exactly what macroevolution is versus microevolution, whether those are even appropriate terms, since most of them would say that microevolutionary processes, natural selection, genetic drift, and mutations, just accumulate over long times to create macroevolutionary patterns. But some evolutionary biologists believe there are other factors in play that are involved in larger scale changes over long periods of time. So why different genera and families have more species than others are macroevolutionary patterns. And maybe there are mechanistic explanations that go beyond just the microevolutionary explanations creating microevolution. That's an internal debate. But nonetheless, macro and microevolution kind of straddle that below species and above species boundary.
Okay. And then how about hyperevolution? What do you mean by hyperevolution?
Yeah, so all I mean there is if you say that, okay, the parts of that word, right? Evolution, and evolution is change over time, in its simplest definition again. And you'd say that, okay, biologists or conventional scientists have been studying species populations for a long time. They've measured rates of mutations, rates at which populations change, and allele frequencies and so forth, and even measured like how quickly species can adapt. So they're measuring the rate of evolution, how fast things change. And then there's also inferences we can get from the fossil record. So you can look at deep time and you can have inferences of how fast species have changed over time. And those two kind of match up fairly well in terms of like what is the time and the length of time you sort of need in order to create a new species. Right. So if we have an idea of what the overall regular rate is of how fast evolution can proceed, young Earth creationists are saying thousands of species could have formed over the period of a few hundred years. Conventional biologists kind of, that's like a dizzying idea to them because there isn't any evidence that we have found that speciation can happen at such a fast pace. And so that's why we characterize that as hyperspeciation or hyperevolution. It's ultra fast evolution beyond anything we've ever described before.
Is there anyone who believes in this hyperevolution outside of a small corner of evangelical Christianity?
I'm sure there are, but nothing comes directly to mind. I think that there are probably some. I mean, I get emails and letters from a variety of people who think they have, a new explanation for the origin of life or where life came from on Earth that are not creationists. They're not evolutionists, and they have some of their own personal idea that was given to them by a vision or something, and they have some wild ideas about how species could have formed really, really quickly. But the difference between them and young Earth creationists is generally young Earth creationists are trying to work within what they think is a scientific framework in the sense that they're trying to come up with natural excellence. They're saying this is something that happens by providence, by God has enabled the world to work in this fashion that things can happen as quickly as they imagine they can.
How do you respond?
It seems like the young.
Oh, I'm sorry. How do you respond to your peers who look at young Earth creation and, to be frank, even old Earth creation and intelligent design, who make some of the same arguments? Maybe their calendars are different, but they make some of the same anti-evolutionary arguments. And how do you respond to your peers who ask you, why are you still a Christian? Because they see that as Christianity and they think you're a fish out of water.
You mean like my peers here at the university?
Yes. Yeah, your peers who aren't members of the faith, maybe, who are agnostic or atheist, who look at Christianity as a superstition because they see Christianity and through the voice of Ken Ham or others that seem to be cognitively dissonant when it comes to reality. In other words, you're talking about this hyperevolution, which is a position that's been forced on young Earth creationists, right? They started to build the ark. They realized they couldn't fit that many species on it, and so they don't just say maybe we're wrong about our interpretation of Scripture. Now they create this whole new idea that is really mentally or intellectually dishonest, if I can be open about it, and it seems to be cognitively dissonant. It seems that their gurus have said the raptures are going to come last Wednesday, and when it didn't, they create a new scenario. And so when we have loved ones and friends who might not consider Christ or the gospel because they see this, forgive me, this clown car of Christianity, and they just assume because you claim to be a Christian that you're part of it. Is there a disconnect when they realize that you're I've had friends who have PhDs say, people have said to them, how could you be a Christian? You're so smart.
Well, I've had every reaction. And when I came here as a new professor and faculty here found out that I was a Christian, I'm sure a few of them had this, oh boy, I wonder what we're getting into here. And part of that was because we have several faculty who I'm very great friends with now who have past experiences where they have fundamentalist, or they were brought up fundamentalist Christian, or have family members that are very much into young earth creationism still. And so their whole perspective on what Christianity is a kind of a Ken Ham world. And so they do see that disjunct from sort of like this anti-intellectualism. And so they can't imagine how somebody would come into and still be a Christian, but not sort of hold to those ideals. And then I've had other faculty who have just like, you have that same response. Well, you're seen to be a really smart guy, so how could you possibly hold on to this still? But I think what they find is that they have sort of these false views, right, of what it takes to be a Christian, or what a Christian can believe, and that they can have a rational faith that's based on actually using your intellects and understanding the scripture and in a more more sophisticated way. I don't want to say sophisticated because I think you don't have to be sophisticated to understand the real message of the Bible, but to really be able to communicate its message and understand how it applies to science takes some sophistication. It's more than just this very wooden literalism. And I do also want to say that. Well, no, let's go on. Something else will come up. I have another idea. I'm sure it'll branch into something else. If you've read my blog, you know that I don't use too many words.
So are the lay creationists, the lay young earth creationists, and kind of regular everyday Christians, are they following this kind of significant change that's being promoted through the organization, at least at the organization level, about these species changes that are occurring so quickly after Noah's Ark? Are they catching it? Do you see that trickling down into the common understanding?
That's a great question. And as a scientist, I would like to have a more rigorous answer to that, in the sense that I would love to have some data. I would love to have some surveys, and I would like to give you some statistics on that. But I can't do that. All I can do is say that I'm pretty close to a lot of young earth creationists. I go to quite a few young earth creationist conventions, and I sit around and I listen to what other people are saying, and I read a lot of blogs. And so I guess in that sense, I have observational data to go on. And my answer is a little bit tricky. It's yes and it's no. It's no, that it hasn't trickled down, in the sense that most young earth creationist followers have been told for so long in very simplistic language that God created all these creatures with these amazing features, like the giraffe, and it has this long neck that is intelligently designed, and it couldn't have possibly come along any other way. And yet now, if you probe the young earth creationist literature, sort of the intellectual literature underneath, you find out that they're now saying that no, they could have started out with shorter necks, and maybe they were programmed to have longer necks. Maybe there's still some sort of design there, but God didn't directly create them that way. And so that's where the hyperevolution comes in, is that they're changing since they were created into things that you wouldn't recognize from their original creation. And so I think a lot of them haven't really grasped that yet. I know when I was at the Ark encounter, there were people there who were looking at the animals that they had pictured on the Ark, and they were kind of like, there was a little bit of a puzzlement, like, what is this thing? I don't really recognize it, because the Ark encounter is trying to capture the original essence somehow of a kind that is then changed into what we see today. And that's a little bit mind-blowing to a lot of their followers when they first see it. On the other hand, they've also been programmed to easily believe this as well, that things can change very easily. Ken Ham and others are constantly showing pictures of lots of different breeds of dogs, right, that are so different from one another, and yet clearly they came from a wolf ancestor. And so it's easy to say, well, look at all this change. See how quickly it happened? And if you look at a wolf and a coyote, or a fox and a African wild dog, they don't really look any more different than a Chihuahua does from a Great Dane. So from a follower who's not a biologist or doesn't know science, they can look at those different canines or different cats, and they can say, oh yeah, they're not that different from each other. And it's easy to convince them that, oh yeah, they could have just changed in the last 1,000 years. I don't have any problem with that. So it's not hard to convince them because they don't, well, honestly, because they don't know enough biology to realize that there's a big difference between a fox and an African wild dog compared to a Chihuahua and a Great Dane. Those are apples and oranges.
Yeah.
In a debate, in a debate with Dennis Venema, Nathaniel Jeanson admitted in a cross-examination period that he believed that there was a common ancestor on the ark for bovidae, or for cattle and sheep. So cattle and sheep look a little bit different than the wolf and the wild dog. So how big a surprise is that to as Kristine brought up, just the average young earth creationist who grew up with it in the homeschool curriculum, and they haven't caught up with the Nathaniel Jeansons, and maybe they haven't been to the Ark Encounter. But you mentioned that you've heard of people go to the Ark Encounter and be surprised at some of their hybrid animals that they have on display there, and maybe even the saddles on the dinosaurs in the pre-Ark time. So my question to you is this: is young earth creation a generational thing that's going to be passing away soon because the younger people just aren't going to buy this massive change of hyperevolution? Or is it something that's got a foothold? I mean, it's $1 million industry for Ken Ham. I mean, he's just killing it in the homeschool area. So, I mean, how do you see it playing out? Is it going to be hundreds of years as it was with astronomy and before the church caught up to Galileo and Copernicus?
That's a great question. I don't have a very comforting answer. I do think that it's going to take a long time. I think in a way it'll always be here, because there's always going to be Christians who feel that are always going to be seeking for that simple answer to questions of the world, and they're going to be caught up into the God said it, therefore I believe it, and reading the Bible in such a way that they feel that they can't accept any other answer but some of the things that young earth creationists are saying now. And they will feel compelled to continue to believe it, even if they see evidence to the contrary. Now, backing up a little bit, I think that the hyper evolution thing, I think, does create some rifts within young earth creationism, which opens up some avenues to maybe get followers to think more about the topic itself and really address, like, well, what do I really believe? And that's partly where I'm going with some of my articles, that I'm just trying to get people to think about whether this makes sense or not, for them to even just start asking questions about, well, why do I believe this? Why do I believe that they could have changed this much? Or maybe I should believe that they aren't. And when I say that there's a rift there, over there at Institute for Creation Research, ICR versus AIG, I think that there is a growing difference in how much they're willing to accept of this hyper evolution. So like when Jeanson says all bovidae, I'm not sure all young earth creationist leaders are going to buy into that. And I think there's going to be some pushback. And that creates some interesting avenues of further discussion and maybe some chinks in the armor there. But as you said, Ken Ham's the 10,000-pound gorilla in the situation. And in a lot of ways, whatever he and his people say is what 90% of the followers are going to hear. And that's going into the homeschool curriculum. And that's being perpetuated out there at a very high rate. And it kind of overwhelms the Todd Woods and other people that might actually be more reasonable and might have other ideas that are really very different than some of Ken Ham's ideas, but they're just not heard. I mean, they don't get heard. They don't have a big enough audience. and so they don't have a big impact. So it really rises and it falls based on Ken Ham. And when his organization changes in the future, because he won't be here forever, that'll be an interesting time. But I think there'll always be some pockets of young Earth creation, just like there are pockets of geocentrism and other things in the world today. But maybe they're at their apex right now. That certainly could be the case, but I don't see a steep decline.
That's too bad. So as far as like these animals that are on the ark, these created kinds, did they go through this hyperevolution process from the time of creation until the time of the flood, or is that just something that happened after the flood, according to young Earth creation?
Some of these things are a little hard to get a grasp on because there's not a lot of discussion of some what you'd think would be obvious topics, like what did the world look like right after creation? Like what did those animals look like? How many were created? If there was giraffes made at creation, were there just 2 of them, or were there hundreds of thousands of them? Did they have a lot of variation to begin with? Would you have seen multiple different species of giraffes if they were different kinds in the original creation? These things I can hardly find anyone who even talks about that in the literature. But let's go back to the Ark Encounter or the Creation Museum. They do have a diagram there of which I think gives sort of their big picture thinking. They have a new display of primate evolution, not including humans, of course, but in primate evolution, or hyperevolution, they have God creating one original primate. So they have a picture of an odd-looking primate that I don't think anyone would recognize today. And then they show this diagram where they have like it changing into multiple different kinds of primates before the flood. So that's some kind of speciation. So in that original environment, it changed into multiple different species of primates. And then, of course, only 2 individuals survived the flood. And then after that, you have chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas, and then a whole bunch of extinct species that changed after the flood. So that's that hyperspeciation that most people are thinking of to create the variation that exists in the world today. So it looks like they are thinking that, yes, there's a variation. It expanded, and then there was a giant bottleneck, right, where only 2 are taken out of that variation. And then you have a re-expansion into the world to create today's variation. And so it's almost like that world of the original creation is a foreign place that you and I could not really even conceive of what it looked like and felt like, which to me is odd, because I think of the Bible as speaking to us. And when we read about Adam and Eve, to me, that's a world that I can understand, not a foreign, weird, bizarre world in which I can't relate to.
Yeah, I've actually wondered about how many of each thing did God make? Like when he made trees, was it like a pair of trees? Was it just a few? That has, from that perspective anyway, I have wondered. You talked a little bit about the hyperevolution being promoted by Answers in Genesis. Give us a couple examples from the Ark Encounter that you've seen.
The easy one is they do have an image there of what about canines, and it has a picture of an original canine, and then it has like a kind of like what we call a phylogenetic tree, showing how that original canine changed into the 35 different species that are alive today, and it says on that description that through natural selection and the alleles changing and the environment affecting these organisms, that they adapted to the different parts of the world and became the species that exist today. Well, that's a lot of speciation, and to me that's hyperspeciation, because that's 35 plus extinct species, all evolving from 2 common ancestors in 4,000 years. I don't know of any scientific mechanism that can make that happen. So you'd have to say that everything was sped up to some enormous degree by in some way we don't understand yet.
Joel, isn't it less than 4,000 years, though? I mean, if you're reading the Bible as they do as literal history, you've got camels early in Genesis. I mean, it's not 4,000 years later, it's 400 years later. It's in the time of Abraham,
Yeah.
right? So wouldn't it almost
Yeah.
be like a comic book? And I mean, is this ironic for you, for people who had ridiculed for years the idea of punctuated equilibrium, and then they come out with something that's just about pretty much that version of young Earth creation?
Right. A dog has 10 pups, and each one goes on to become a new species. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of saltation going on, just immediate large scale changes. And there are creationist theories that of huge like chromosomal changes and transposons that are moving genes around, that are jumping around and then making these big changes, like the chromosome number changes, and then boom, there's a new species like one generation later. Yeah, that to me is just like wild to think about. And it's also a little bit scary because if that kind of change could happen that fast, I would think that the world would be running down and falling apart far faster than it appears to be. Or at least, in this idea of the creationism that everything is running down. The future looks very grim if we truly are breaking apart these genomes into many species that quickly. Where does it end? Can they continue to speciate, or are we going to lose all our diversity eventually? The eschatology of creationism is a whole other topic.
Oh, yeah. And if macroevolution can happen, which is what that you just described in a way was different species forming. If according to them it can and does happen, then why still object to mainstream science? Right? Why
Because
say
it's
that
godless, right? Because evolution is godless and leads to all kinds. Great question, Kristine. I'll let the good professor answer before I chime in. Yeah,
It's a tough one. I'm sympathetic to creationists. I mean, I certainly have many friends who are young Earth creationists, and I understand their desire. I mean, many of them, they will accept the science that fits within, that doesn't reject something that they believe is required by the text, right? So all right, I see your evidence for that, and I don't have any reason to not believe that, so I accept that. But and so the hyper-evolution thing is like, well, you can't show me directly that this didn't happen, and it kind of fits with like I realize I need to explain how all those ants on the ark, and this is a way of doing it. So right, they're fighting hard to find a way, and really trying to find a scientific way to explain it. Hyper-evolution is their scientific model. It's not a special creation supernatural explanation. It is like trying to use science, right? So they're trying to respect science in that sense, that they want to find a natural explanation. But on the other hand, they have boundaries, right? So they say, the Bible talks about these different kinds, and it says they were created separately. So therefore, I can't lump them together, even if the evidence for lumping them same as the evidence for lumping all the carnivores together as a carnivore kind, or all the canines as a canine kind. Even though the evidence is the same, I have to reject that because I have a higher reason for rejecting, which is the Bible tells me so. And I can respect that in some ways, because there are things that I have to say that I have to believe because the Bible tells me I must believe those things, even though I don't fully understand them. And so we all as Christians come to some point where I can't rationalize myself to every single point. The faith isn't 100% absolutely explainable. But on the other hand, I of course find the young Earth creationist explanations ridiculous in terms of they're trying to explain away a lot of the things that they don't need to explain away in my mind.
Yeah. One of the criticisms of your article that you wrote with David McMillan goes something like this. If you read certain specific research papers, you wouldn't disagree with me. Since you disagree with me, you're either ignorant of that research because you didn't read it, or you did read it and you're just dishonestly ignoring it. Okay, so knowing how much time you spend reading young Earth creationist literature, I have a hard time believing that you're ignorant. How do you respond to this claim, though, this charge?
In other words, when did you stop beating your wife?
Yeah, right. Yes. My response is that's a bit of a last resort response on their part. It's kind of like I'm not sure what else I'm supposed to say to try to counter your argument. So I'll just say that I believe you didn't either understand me, or and you're ignorant of it, or you're willfully not reading my material, so you didn't know about it. I would say that there are so many things that I've read from many other people, and if an argument isn't very good, it doesn't necessarily need a response. All right, just because you didn't respond to something doesn't mean, or respond specifically to some specific claim, doesn't mean I don't know about it or I don't understand it. I just don't necessarily find it worthy of a response in some cases. If I had to respond to every single claim, I'd be inundated and unable to write anything cogently enough in few enough words that anyone would ever read it. If you read the blog responses, the responses on my blog, you'll find that there's all kinds of like, you need to read this, you need to read this, you have to read this, why didn't you read this, you should have read this, and you haven't responded to that. I have read most of those things, and you have to pick out the general picture, and you have to stick to forming responding where a response is needed, and being able to ignore the things that are just sort of the chaff that's there, that's sort of thrown out there, hoping that you'll spend a lot of time responding to it when it's not really worth your time.
Yeah, that's good. Don't get distracted. Keep the main thing the main thing. That's good. You once wrote this satire piece, Worldwide Famine During Joseph's Day. Aren't some young Earth creationists moving toward this worldwide famine model to be consistent hermeneutically? What are some problems with this approach?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I'm trying to remember who. Somebody else gave me the idea for that piece to write about Joseph's famine, and when I started to read that, I really can't remember where I got the exact idea, but I realized that reading about Joseph's famine, that a lot of the words that are used in that text in Genesis 41 are so similar. Well, actually, they are the same Hebrew words used to describe a global flood and aspects of creation. So that seemed like a great way of saying to creationists, if you want to have a consistent hermeneutic, and you're going to say that you need to interpret the Bible with the Bible, or use words in the Bible to understand how words are used, then if you're going to interpret the flood as being global, then you need to also interpret the famine of Joseph's time as being a global famine, and that people came from everywhere in the world to come to get grain from him. And so I wrote it as a satire piece, and what I hope a good satire piece should be is something that makes you reflect on, like, oh, you know what? Now that you put it in this context, I realize that maybe I'm being overly literal, or I'm not looking for what are potentially other viable explanations or viable interpretations of the scripture, which would be perfectly in line with the overall scope and context of the whole scriptures. So I have to admit, I was quite in shock, because I did a lot of research to find out, are there other Christians out there that actually believe this already? Do they take a hyper literal reading of Genesis 41? And so I wanted to know, does anyone do that before I write the satire piece? And I did find a few, but very obscure people who were pointing this out, that, oh, this must have been a worldwide event. But I would say that almost nobody knew about them. And I couldn't find any serious scholars who were saying that. So I was shocked when I was listening to a particular talk by an Answers in Genesis employee, who then started to talk about this global famine of Joseph's time and went through all the same terms and showed how they must be used in the same way that they're used in Genesis 9. And therefore, the famine must also be global. And then tried to incorporate his model of genetics and other evidence from like the Ice Age and other things to try to provide sort of a natural explanation for how this could happen. How could people come from the rest of the world? I find it a very forced, unnatural explanation, but I will give this person credit for being consistent. If they're going to say you have to read these terms this way, they recognize that they need to also do it in Genesis 41. I think it makes the point even better that they haven't really considered alternative hypotheses and put them to the test as well.
But isn't the most consistent young Earth creationist the flat earther who believes in a firmament, in an actual hard firmament? I mean, if we're going to go by consistency, it's making a comeback, and they look at Ken Ham and AIG as compromisers because they're technically compromising the text.
Yeah. I've sat in a dinner with a geocentrist speaker who was invited to do a debate. And I think even the people who invited him didn't know he's a geocentrist. They just knew of his young Earth creationist sort of writing. And then at the dinner, he then goes into this long thing about geocentrism and the whole history of this and how they have to believe this because it's the only consistent reading of Scripture. And what shocked me was he didn't get a lot of pushback, from this group. And I guess I shouldn't have been shocked. I mean, they're kind of set up for, oh, well, you're right. If we believe this, this, and this, well, maybe we do have to go there. There's a lot of hot heads nodding there. Now, at the end of the day, a lot of them are like, that's just a bridge too far. I can't believe that. And so I think there's some cognitive dissonance there, and they kind of put that on. They said there must be some other explanation, and they haven't really dealt with it. But I don't think they've really dealt with like, okay, what's the core reason why I'm not willing to accept that, but I will accept these other younger tenets. But it's issues like that we as Christians who want people to think more deeply can use to get people to maybe think that next level and ask themselves, why am I being inconsistent, or is there an inconsistency here?
So you write a lot about this on your blog, Naturalis Historia, or AKA the Natural Historian. What are some other topics that you cover, and what's been kind of your most popular post or posts?
I cover whatever I'm just interested in at the time. But of course, I do talk a lot about, where young Earth creationist commentary has gone wrong. But I also am very interested in talking about the interface of science and faith and trying to get at some theological issues as well. In fact, that's what I'm more interested in doing in the future, because I realize that just knocking down creationism and saying why their science is wrong, it is unlikely to convince anybody that they should change. They need something positive to change too. What is a better theology here? What is a better understanding? So what's popular on my blog? Well, I tell you, if you want clicks, if popularity is social media, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth, well, then you have to mention Ken Ham and dinosaurs. And then, you get a lot of people to read your article. And it is enticing to write about those types of topics because a lot of people are interested in them and they read those. And so that is a way to get people to read my blog. I started the blog thinking I would write about John Ray from the 1600s and Cotton Mather, who wrote this huge tome, Biblia Americana. And I wanted to analyze he writes a lot about science. He was really interested in science, and he wrote a lot about creation. And I wanted to explore some of the things he did. But I found out pretty quickly that if you write about something in the 1700s, it's really hard to make anyone want to come read it. And that's been a big disappointment of mine, but I guess I understand. But I really feel like old, stuff from we're just recapitulating things that people have already discussed 300 years ago and have really hashed out some of these things. And yet we just keep propagating the same problems over and over and over again. So I thought it's great to look at history and learn from that. But if no one looks at history, I guess you can't learn from it. So, you got to stick to the present.
So young Earth creation doesn't just have a problem with biology, as you brought out with Kristine's question about the worldwide famine and so forth. They literally have to be at war with almost every major science, from geology to anthropology, to plate tectonics to embryology. All of these things, if they believe Genesis is history, then Babel would have been the center of civilization and worked out from there, and that's how languages came about and so forth. So my question wants to transition from young Earth creation, which I think outside of the Christian circle is looked at like flat Earth stuff, to be honest with you. Right? People who didn't grow up fundamentalist or evangelical, even Christians who are overseas. N.T. Wright says it's not a common conversation in England. So my question to you is this: what do you think is the greater danger or obstacle to Christian testimony, young Earth creation, or, for example, those brands of old Earth creation that attack the sciences in the same way that young Earth creation does? In other words, that are anti-evolutionary a priori.
Wow, that's a really good question too. Since I've grown up around young Earth creationism, and that's been my central interest because I care about my friends and family and churches and pastors who deal with that all the time. This is the reason that's the reason I spend most of my effort in that area, because I understand them better. I understand their concerns, and I feel like I can talk to them, as opposed to other denominations or other Christians who may be more influenced by intelligent design. I certainly know many old Earth creationists. So I guess, okay, going back to your question. So which is the greater danger? That's really hard for me to say. I'm more sympathetic, you might, if I know you've seen my blog and read my blog, you probably know that I rarely address intelligent design or even old Earth creationism, and in a way that's a conscious thing. It's not that I don't have criticisms. It's just that I don't feel like that's my primary focus or my primary audience. I am concerned about intelligent design because I think the world is intelligently designed. I'm a believer in the sovereignty of God and that He's in control of all things. And so I do see design in everything, but I'm not an apologist who is looking for that proof text, that proof from science or proof from evidence. Like if I could show that God had to have made this thing, that's going to convince everybody. I don't think that is what convinces people to come to faith in Christ. And so I see that as a misguided venture, to try to put all your marbles into this, like I'm going to convince people in this way through being kind of scientific about it. And ultimately it's not scientific, because it ends up doing a lot of the same things that young Earth creationism does. It just sort of sounds more legitimate and is more, it seems more acceptable in the church. But you're right, from the perspective of a secular colleague at a university, a biologist, they don't really see the difference between intelligent design. It's all creationism to them, and that's where it's important for me to, as myself, as just an individual, show that I can be a faithful Christian without having to I don't want to have to defend that. I don't even know where I'm going with this thought anymore. But anyway, I'm not sure what the answer is. How about that?
Fair enough.
Sure. So let's change directions then just a little bit and talk about, you've mentioned that early in this pandemic, like even before it was really a thing here, you started having your students do some research and some studying on COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2. So you guys have been right on top of it right from the get-go. What have they been finding? What tell us about their progress?
Well, yeah, when I say doing research, I would say it's more like it's what I'm having my students do. And by students, I mean not my like my research students from my lab, but my students in my class. And so I was teaching a class I was teaching evolutionary biology in the spring, but I also was teaching genomics. And so we started talking, I mean, in January, I think the second week of class, I said, well, I heard about this virus in Wuhan, and I think it'd be interesting to look and to sort of trace, what we're going to find out about that virus. So we looked at the genome very early on, and then I would have like weekly reports. And eventually, I had them all, I worked it into the class to the point where, okay, everyone has to write a paper in which you tell me something new about either the genome of the virus, or how the genome has changed, or how this virus relates to other viruses. In other words, sort of like a phylogeny, or like the evolution of the virus itself. And they had to go to the preprint server for biology. That's where people post their manuscripts before they've been published or even been peer reviewed. But that's sort of like the hot place where people are like churning out new stuff and like, here's my idea. So I made them all go, and they had to find a paper, they had to read it, and then they had to relate that to topics in the class. And it was great for me because I got to read 50, well, it's hard for me, but I got to read 50 papers that were basically looking at the brand new, like this was 1 week ago, somebody just, published this about coronavirus. And so that really kept me like on my toes. Like I knew everything that was going on, like the moment that stuff was released. Now, of course, that was in the spring. And so I haven't done as much of that in the summer, but I am working with a colleague right now on a paper, which we're working on something related to coronavirus. Actually, I guess I can't really talk about it very much at the moment because we're trying to get it published in Science, and that would be a huge coup for me. So I'm between trying to prepare for classes. I'm trying to get a little bit of coronavirus research and reading because I need to keep up to date on that.
Well, that's really exciting. I bet your students just learned and grew through this unusual situation in a unique way that many students maybe haven't had that opportunity before. So that's really cool. I'm glad you were able to do that.
Oh, I tell you, they were utterly. At first, they weren't that interested. It's kind of like, oh, right, we'll learn about this. But once they started to realize this was going to become a thing in February, they became very interested. I mean, because a lot of people it's you're self-invested in it, and they really got into it. It's like all they wanted to talk about at some point in the class. So I had to like basically build the rest of the class around that topic in some way.
A follow-up to Kristine's question on the coronavirus. Not long ago, Dennis Venema, a fellow biologist and BioLogos voice, as you are, quipped on his Facebook page that the coronavirus might be the first time that Christian science denial has cost lives. A peer of his corrected him and said, well, that might be true in the short term, but in the long term, it might be the denial of climate science. So my question for you, Joel, is you'd like to be writing about other things, but you're writing about Christian science denial in a sense. And the idea of it costing lives is important, but I'd like to focus on the idea of it costing testimony and maybe becoming an obstacle to actually offering the gospel to a world that might be more open to it if we weren't carrying this baggage into the conversation. How would you, and I know you seemed pessimistic on it earlier in our discussion, but how would you advise others who find this science denial to be such an affront to a world that needs to hear about Christ? What would you say going forward?
I'm glad you asked me that. I am very concerned. I've been very interested in science communication. I talk about it in my classes. I teach a general biology class, and I've told them I try to tell them, how to think about science as a way of providing a way for assessing, what good information and bad information is. And I do absolutely see creation science, the denial of truth, of fake news, all these things kind of coming together to really erode our ability to trust anyone. Right? It's all about ourselves. What's my gut feeling? What do I think is right? And young Earth creationists will say, well, that's not really the case. We have the Bible, right? It tells us what's right. But there's also an arrogance in there that, okay, I can read my Bible and very quickly find out what's right. And then I can tell everybody else what they're supposed to believe. And I can deny everything. And I sort of like, I know the big picture. There's a lack of humility there. And that's one of my biggest concerns with our conversation, what Facebook looks like in terms of how we argue about masks or not masks. And all of this, I guess, shouldn't be a surprise that we're in this situation in this country, that we have spent the last decade or 2 decades eroding our ability to communicate with one another. And Christians in particular have developed this skin of knowing what's right and just telling other people what to believe without being a good listener. I think my big message is that we need to be able to listen first, and to understand other people's concerns, and to realize that we're not all just because I disagree with you, I'm not your enemy. And how can we come to some sort of agreement on anything? Well, we have to be able to discuss information, and we have to be able to agree what some truth is, that there is data that we can use to assess questions, and that we ought not to be afraid of that, because all truth is God's truth, and we need to be willing to put aside what we want to be true and accept that other people might have ideas as well as I am. And I have to do that too. I have to be willing to listen. And that's the most important thing that I think that I try to do, is I try to hear what other people are saying. Let them tell me what their concerns are, so that I can find a way to address those, versus just, I know what the truth is, and this is what you have to believe. Right? No pastor is going to be successful if, yes, they have some truth in them. They're supposed to be preaching the truth and preaching the word, and they should bring it strong when they need to. On the other hand, if they can't listen and find out where their congregation is and what their concerns are, they're never really going to be able to communicate with them.
Kind of leaning on that idea of listening and being aware of other perspectives. What is your experience when students are taught that part of defending Christianity is arguing against evolution or the cold earth? What happens then?
Well, maybe that's a symptom, I think, of, I think what John was talking about this afternoon. I heard you on Facebook this afternoon, and you were talking about how there's so many different Jesuses out there, right? We all think that there's a Jesus for me believing this, or that I'm allowed to do this because Jesus did that, and we erect our own version of what we want Jesus to be. And so students who have been taught one way, that they have to believe something, aren't necessarily coming in, well, they have to believe that because the Bible has told them that. They're doing that because somebody else has told them that that's what they have to believe the Bible says. And they haven't really learned how to think for themselves. And my approach is not, in my classes, I don't tell people what they have to believe. I tell them, here's things that I think everyone needs to know about what people do believe, and here's some of the reasons why they believe those things. And you need to be able to parse for yourself what is important to you. What are the important questions? And you need to ask yourself, why do I believe what I believe? And if you find that there's going to be different answers from different people. And you need to be able to find your own hermeneutic. Well, I don't want to say find your own hermeneutic, because you should be listening to experts and reading, but you need to be casting a wide net to try to find the intellectual skills to be able to answer questions for yourself, rather than simply lean on what you think is the people want an easy answer, right? So they just want to follow an expert who has told them what to believe, and yet they haven't internalized it. They haven't made it their own real belief. They can't defend it. And so I asked them, you need to be able to defend, your particular belief. And if you can defend it, then we can have a conversation and we can find out how good your defense is.
Defending without being defensive. That's kind
or
of
offensive. Yeah.
Or offensive,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. I feel like
my experience, I talk to many students. There's many classes where students will have questions about sort of science and faith, or they're struggling because they come in and they've always been told one thing and they've been told, here's what the professors are going to say, or here's what your response can be. And they come in and they find out, wow, you know what? These people are kind of reasonable and they have some really interesting things to say. And it seems to make a lot of sense to me. And they get really upset and worried, because it is an affront to what they thought they had to believe. And now they're realizing it doesn't completely jive. Like their whole worldview is not quite in sync. And so a lot of faculty say, well, go down and talk to Joel Duff, because, he likes to talk about this type of stuff, and, he'll listen to your concerns. And because I understand their thinking, because I've been there in the past in some ways, and I've known so many people, and I've sat under so many pastors that preach that. I understand the presuppositions. I understand the concerns, and there's, I can offer some strategies for them to at least figure out how to start thinking about moving forward.
Joel, if we have somebody watching right now who's had the experience you just mentioned, they grew up believing that Genesis is a history and you could be read literally, and they get to first semester of college, and whether it's biology or some other course, or even New Testament or something like that, and they realize that the pat certainty that they had coming in was just a house of cards, and the first wind that blows topples their worldview. But they don't have a Professor Joel Duff around, and maybe they're not familiar with BioLogos or other organizations, and they feel that they are unmoored and they have to walk away from the faith. What do you say to that person who's listening right now, who has this opportunity to you about throwing actually the baby out with the bathwater, this binary idea, which, by the way, is reinforced by both Ken Ham and Richard Dawkins, that this is how you read the Bible, and if it's not that, none of it's true. So how do you combat it coming from both sides, the extreme hostile atheist and actually the hostile creationist?
I say, don't make a decision today. Don't feel like you have to throw anything out. Don't think you have to believe anything this particular day. This is a journey you're going to be on, and it's going to take you a while. I've been studying this for 25 years. I still have questions. I have things I don't fully understand. But the important thing to know is that there are hundreds of individuals out there that are exploring the same questions, have had the same questions. There are many, I'd say really most conservative evangelicals are not young earth creationists, right? And so there are many people we can point to and say, these are Christians that have grappled with this and have found a very reasonable understanding, an orthodox understanding of Christianity, and haven't slipped down that path to the thing that you're worried about going. And so you can rest assured that there are many people that have gone before you that have both struggled with the topic, but also come to the conclusion and the realization that the Christian faith is a absolutely viable and necessary faith, and is something that they can rely on and have faith in, right? And so it's not, there's not going to be a one-word answer. There's not going to be, hey, here's this pamphlet, read this, and this will solve all your problems. And I think a lot of people don't want to hear it. I mean, most people want the answer. I like to think of it as it's a giant, it's part of life. It's the exploration of finding out who we are, and growing into a greater connection with God. And part of that is forcing yourself to explore difficult questions, and praying along the way that God guides you through those, and he will lead you to individuals who can give you advice and help you along that path. But there's no magic bullet. There's no tomorrow I'm going to wake up and I'm going to have this whole different belief, and I'm going to have this entirely new framework for understanding the entire scriptures that's all going to make sense. But the basic part of the gospel, makes sense. What we need to know, the simple things that are presented in the Bible, are absolutely true, absolutely clear. And as long as we hold on to that and say that, okay, I have faith, I understand that I need Christ Jesus as my Savior, and I need forgiveness for my sins. And now I'm going to see how I live that out. And it's a journey that I'm not alone in. If I am willing to explore and let other people come alongside me and help me figure out these questions. And I don't mind if at the end of the day you decide that I really have to go back to young earth creationism in terms of like providing me with the comfort zone, or like that's where I've come to, that's what I have to believe in order to hold on to my Christianity. I don't believe that's true, but I'm not going to tell somebody they absolutely can't believe that at all.
What kind of advice would you give to youth leaders, parents, and students? And you touched on this a little bit, but when it comes to talking about science and Christianity, what advice do you give, particularly to say the leadership, parents, youth leaders in the church, youth pastors, pastors in the church? What's some advice that you give them, thinking about how such a large percent of young people just walk away from Christianity after high school, never come back? And the science-faith dialogue is cited often as one of the top reasons why. So what advice do you have to them to hopefully prevent people from walking away from Jesus?
I get asked this enough that I feel like I should have like the scripted out. Here's steps 1, 2, and 3 is what to do. But I really struggle with this as well. I still come back to it's about being humble, about not being absolutely convinced that I have the answer. Youth pastors are under an enormous amount of stress to take certain positions, to show that they're true believers in some ways. And this young earth creationism tries to make this a litmus test, right? It constantly tells their followers, you ask your youth pastor, you ask your pastor, what is your position? And if they don't say the right thing, then you need to get out of there, or you need to raise a stink, or and so forth. And so they're in a very difficult situation. But I would say that I still think that being humble, being a good listener, and saying that this is a complex question that people have wrangled with over many, many years, kind of like baptism or something like that. There's something that we can, as Christians, disagree about. And I can say that a pastor can say, this is what I see in the scriptures and what I think is probably the way that I think that I would interpret this, but I understand that there's multiple interpretations by faithful Christians, and I think it's important for young people to know that. and to encourage young people to actually read about those different things, not to simply shunt them to, here's this book, answers and whatever, and it will provide the answer. But no, read different viewpoints and be willing to expose yourself to those. And if our viewpoint really is the strongest, I'll believe that you'll come back to it. But if it isn't, you'll have at least read those different things, and you'll have a chance of making your own decision.
Joel, I always save the hardest question for me for last. I'll still give Kristine an
these are hard
opportunity.
already.
Well, this is where I channel my atheist friends who I know might be listening, and if they wanted to ask a question, it would sound something like this. So I'll take you back to the first place where I think faith and science actually collided or had a difference, which was probably astronomy, right? Galileo and Copernicus. And that didn't really get sorted out for a few hundred years, and it was both Catholic and Protestant got that wrong. If you read Luther and Calvin and the popes, they all got it wrong. And they didn't just get the science wrong, they got the interpretation of the Bible wrong. And for a couple hundred years, if you look at it this way, Christians stole the glory of God for getting that wrong. And they put an obstacle in front of those outside of the faith and made them choose between what they saw maybe more clearly in God's book of nature than in God's book of scripture. So my question to you is this, and I'll ask this as an atheist. If you Christians have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit who's going to lead you into all truth, if you have the mind of Christ, if you have the authority of the Word of God, and you're so wrong on the age of the earth and on T-Rex bunking with Noah on the ark, how can I trust you about the resurrection of Jesus? And why would I?
Well, you shouldn't trust me. I'm a fallible human being, and the Bible itself tells me that. It tells me my mind is corrupted in some way, and that I will have self-interest, and that I will find answers that I would like to believe myself and put myself above God. And so when I look down through the annals of history and I look at the scriptures are full of stories of people that were wrong about things and that tried to place their views above the Holy God's direction. And so we are a species that has consistently tried to avoid the truth. But there's also a long string and a long strand of the core aspects of the faith that have not changed, and of faithful Christians who have found the core values of the Bible and the core teachings and have maintained them. And of course, little branches come off all the time, spin off as little cults and variations on themes. But one of the remarkable things about Christianity is its persistence over time. And that itself, I think, is an evidence of a fundamental truth that is involved, that is expressed by the authors of the Bible, who are inspired by God to communicate the things that are essential for us to know as human beings. But we are also know that we are bound to create confusion, and we've been very good at that, and we have gone down through historical cycles of placing ourselves in a position of saying what God says is truth and it not being the truth. And so I look at it as we are constantly being corrected. And part of that correction is atheists and others who point out where Christians have been really, really dumb. And we need to apologize for that. We need to ask for forgiveness from God for being stubborn. And if we are, again, I come back to that same word, humble. We need to be more humble and realize that we also make mistakes. and we need to learn from them as well.
That's good. Do you have anything else you'd like to share that you would like our audience to know? Anything else in your heart?
I don't know. I bet. Thank you for the time. These are difficult things to talk about, and as you can see, I'm stumbling my way through it.
No, I
and
think
maybe
it's
that
been
part of the
been-
lesson is that is that we, I've got this huge set of books behind me. I have hundreds of books on science and faith, and I feel like at times the more you learn, the more you find out you don't know, that you don't understand. And so there's that kind of curve there, right, where you first find out something and you think you know everything, and then you have to push through and find out, oh yeah, look, I really don't understand these topics very well. And so I want people to know that I don't have all the answers. There's things that I wake up at night thinking, I just don't really understand that. I never have, and I can't wait to get to heaven and get the explanation. And be able to I often think that we're going to be able to explore this entire creation, through eternity. Right? As a scientist, I have this hope that I'll be able to actually look back through time and just see everything that God has done and be able to find out how He actually did it. Right? I'm trying to figure that out now. How did He do it? But I like to believe that someday I'll actually know how He actually did it.
I just want to say this. Kristine knows this, and some of our viewers know that I was one of those Christians who really held, except for the flat earth, I held every position. When I fell down the origin stairs, I hit my head on every step. And so I was young earth creation, and I was gap theory, and I was, reasons to believe, and with the dash of Stephen Meyer. And then I was confronted by the Francis Collins book, The Language of God, and I'm reading it, and I'm telling my wife about it, and I felt like I was kicked in the stomach because I admired the man, and I knew what he was saying was compelling, and I knew I was being confronted with the truth, and I knew I'd been wrong my whole life. And as troubling as that book was, I followed it up with Deb and Lauren Harzma's book, Origins, and that one, if Francis Collins was the jab that rocked me, that was the overhand right that knocked me out, and that convinced me to accept evolutionary, theory. And I just want to say this for people watching who are young Earth or old Earth and still think that maybe we're a little wacky. The created world and science was never more fascinating to me until that moment, until I realized that no, evolution isn't the agent of creation, it's just God's mechanism. And since then I've been binging on books, and one of the first ones that I came across was one that you wrote a couple chapters to, Joel, and it's the Grand Canyon Monument to an Ancient Earth. And now that I live 4 hours from the Grand Canyon, it's really, I see it. It's really special to me. So one of the reasons we exist, the Sparrow's Call and Voices in the Wilderness, is to connect people who are going through a crisis of faith and who might think they need to walk away because what they grew up with, they find out now, is a house of cards. And we want to point them to the voices in the wilderness that can be a safety net for them. And Joel, you're one of them, and we really appreciate your work, and not just your work, but your demeanor. You've brought up humility a number of times today, and I think your response to really unfair attacks, I love Nathaniel Jeanson as a brother, but I think it's the attack of being scientifically dishonest and so forth. I mean, just your grace under that kind of thing is a real model for us and how Christian civility should be. So I just wanted to, this is something Kristine normally does, because I'm a Kindle guy. All my books are on Kindle, but when they're pictures of this brilliant, I buy the book. So I wanted to wave it and say, people, this is a wonderful book to get, and we would direct you to Joel's website. at Naturalist, Historia, and so forth. So on behalf of the show, Joel, I want to thank you for coming on. And I'm looking forward to having you and David on together, because I know the dynamic duo. I want to dig into some of the things you said in that article. Kristine, I'll give you the last word.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us. I was once told that an expert is someone who knows more and more about less and less until they know absolutely everything about nothing at all. I'm not sure that that's quite right, but I do agree that as we learn more, there's so much in God's creation to learn and to study and to understand, and the unfathomable depths of Scripture. For teaching and training and instruction in righteousness. I'm just so glad to have you on today and share your thoughts with us. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And it's so fantastic seeing both of you. I really, really enjoyed this time.